Today, I'm super excited about day two because while we talked a lot about data and the technology related to developing data and data production and consumption yesterday, all related to active transportation, today we'll be speaking to a lot of folks who've been in this area, both on the evangelist side, the elected side, the policy side, and trying to better understand how our joint advocacy can really support change in terms of a move forward to better enable active transportation, first in our region, but also nationally. And I think this conversation is super important, especially right now in light of the changed administration that has taken place. I think we all acknowledge that priorities may have changed. And the question of the day, I think, is how do we join up together to continue the really important work that each of us is doing in terms of furthering both the understanding, the storytelling, the ethnographic work, but also how that translates into data and data-driven efforts to improve active transportation and just overall like living and quality of life in our region. So I think there's no better person to start us off in that conversation. Mike May is a consultant and accessibility technology navigation advisor. He's been an advisor for the American Printing House for years. He was chief evangelist for Good Maps, who you heard from a little bit yesterday through Justin Deno's presentation. And he was an envisioner of last mile transportation for many years, even before it was popular. He's been a pioneer in product and business development since 1980, worked for Central Intelligence Agency as a political risk analyst for the Bank of California in automating wire transfers and cash machines, and for TRW, starting a new business area. Mike's startup ventures have included developing the world's first and only laser turntable, inventing a portable heating cushion for sports and medical applications, and he started 2 other adaptive technology companies. Mike May has a master's degree from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and honorary Doctor of Humane Letters from Coker College, South Carolina. He's met 5 presidents, including President Obama, and for many of other distinguishing facts, he's also been a member of the White House delegation for the 2010 Paralympics and has been inducted into the U.S. Association of the Blind Hall of Fame. And most recently, I saw that he was inducted into the Consumer Technology Association Hall of Fame as well. I am so glad to introduce you to Mike May and ask you to come tell us about first last mile transportation. Thank you.
Yeah, the first challenge of the day was when the speakers are all over the room, there's no directionality, and I thought, well, which way do I head? So I found it. I'm here. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about my favorite topic. It actually goes back to when I went blind at age 3, and I certainly have learned through life that the better you get around, the better you engage in life. And the exciting thing was, of course, when GPS became a thing 25 years ago, I realized that it could get me to the vicinity of things, which was good. When Bill Clinton signed the selective availability waiver in January of 2001, we went from 100 yards, 100-meter accuracy, down to 10. That was a big deal. And people would say, 100 meters was bad. Well, it still got you to the building, to the vicinity, so I thought that was pretty cool. 10 meters was even better. But now we all face in the different kinds of technologies that we do and all the different companies in this space and research, how do you resolve the last few feet? So I have a 5-letter acronym that would be censored on the air, but it's the final frustrating frigging 50 feet. Now indoors, that could be 15 feet, or it could be 5 feet, but you get the idea. You get close, you think you're there, and then what do? So this last mile problem, as it's generally referred to, is something that is not just for accessibility, it's for everybody. And it's getting better, but what are some of the different ways to deal with it? I'm always in my talks discussing the accessible toolbox, because you can't do this with just one thing. I mean, it's a combination of things. And of course, that's the problem, and that's why we have things like the Complete Trip project, because you've got multiple apps and devices and agencies and all sorts of people involved in how do you get so from A to Z. People are different, situations are different, so it's not as though there's one thing that you can use all the time for all situations. There's two basic components, as you know. One is the signal, which is the GPS, and we can't do much about that. I mean, it's getting better, as I say, and it'll probably continue to get better, but slowly over time, we can't really do anything about that. But there are other things we can do to mitigate getting to the actual pinpoint destination that you want. We can use information. This is kind of the cheapest, easiest, and maybe least attended to solution. And when I had my first GPS product starting in 2000, we immediately created a user point of interest database, because when the data is weak, which it often is, you have a central address for a whole mall, and all the businesses have the same address, you might not even be 100 meters away, you might be 200. So we got a grant for something we called the Blind Army. And what we did is we got about 20 blind people, and we went to San Francisco. We went along the Bay Area Rapid Transit Corridor, and we marked stuff. So there's an elevator for each one of those BART stations, usually one, but there are maybe 4 entrances. So we went along, we would annotate a point of interest. First, we would record it right at the elevator, and then it would be called Northwest 7th and Market, 15 feet from the corner. So now you knew about where to look. And you know, in urban canyon situations, that accuracy can be pretty bad. But now that you knew where to look, it was a lot easier to find. And the same thing with any other point of interest. There's things like steps, grass, fountains, coffee shops. So if you can imagine, if all points of interest were annotated by some piece of information like that, and it was shared, that's a key factor, it needs to be shared, then you're better off. So that's one, I think, underutilized aspect of user points of interest, of crowdsourcing. The other thing is to find the best combination of verbal cues, sound events, haptics. In order to get guided to something, it's not always best to have a whole lot of information. Sometimes you want something very short, or you want vibrations. There's a huge issue that I don't hear many people talk about, which is you've got all this great navigation in transit centers, but you also have loud trains and speakers and all this stuff. You can't hear them. When I get into the BART station at MacArthur in Oakland, there's a freeway on either side. Outside, the only way I can hear my navigation cues to find the elevators or the escalators is if I have my AirPod Max over-the-ear headphones, noise canceling that I use on the airplane. That's not something you normally want to do in terms of your mobility. My dog's good, but I like my ears. Another component of the toolbox is know before you go. You have a much more likely chance of finding your destination and with those last few feet if you know ahead of time what's coming up. And that can be through systems like XR Navigation's Audium, APH's Monarch tactile display. So if you can feel an overview of where things are, then you have it in your mind and there's less stress on you when you actually are trying to find the location. And you know before you go, you learn things like, oh, by the way, that restaurant is inside a mall on the second floor, instead of wandering around on the street and the GPS tells you you're within 30 feet, but it doesn't tell you that it's 33 feet vertically. Setting expectations realistically is important because people have this idea that navigation is going to do everything for you and forget about your dog or your cane or a human guide. So set the expectations and then people are less disappointed. The human in the loop is important for the last few feet. On the apps I've been involved with, we have either an Aira or Be My Eyes button. So if you just can't find it, then you call up a person and have the camera used for that. I don't find those apps, by the way, very helpful for navigating, let's say, through an airport or particularly a place where there's poor connectivity, but they're great in the last few feet. So you see you have a combination of use navigation that gets me to the vicinity and then use some other tool to get right up to it. I'd like to see somebody integrate this Seeing AI app, which I love for just walking along and letting it blurt to me all the text information in the world. But if I get close to a door, and let's say there's one entrance for a men and women's restroom, but you have to go into a general alcove and then you split off left or right to get into it, you could use something like Seeing AI to, if you flipped over to it, to then read the signs, because you don't always know where the labels are. I can't feel all the walls. I've ended up in the wrong restroom, feeling the walls, and then I'm in the wrong place. I need to use an OCR app in that situation to give me the final important information. Of course, everybody's hoping that AI will take care of a lot of this navigation, and I'm already seeing in my own use, for example, trying to identify an Uber vehicle. And this is the last few feet too, that they're in the vicinity, but they just happen to be across the street. And I've used my Ray-Ban Meta glasses to identify the make of the car and even to see the license plate. It's not 100% reliable, but it's an option, and I think it's going to get better. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves and think, well, let's just drop everything and AI is going to take care of it for us. It's not that. Collaboration is the other way. Like I said, using things like Seeing AI in conjunction with Good Maps or Waymap or Next from the Netherlands or any of the other indoor navigations. It's important to understand the strengths and the weaknesses. I think one of my favorite combinations I'd love to see is something like NaviLens, which is amazing at the last few inches. I mean, it gets you right to something, almost like an AirTag. And so if you combine that with an indoor navigation app like Good Maps gets you the vicinity, NaviLens gets you the last few inches, and just get those two apps to be married, and voila, we have a really good solution. Let me look through my notes, see if I could, I hope these kind of spark conversations through the day or future conversations with people, because there's so much technology and devices being used in navigation, and I think we're going to see those different apps and navigations on things like the Make Sense Vector, on the Glide from Glidance, the robot. But we have to get those conversations going before we can get the collaborations to happen. So that's a lot to chew on, and I hope we have a chance during the day to chat a bit more, or grab my card and we can have a future conversation. Thank you. Oh yeah, if you have time, sure. I like to stay within my allotted amount of time, but I'm here. Any questions or comments?
So you've been in the area of accessible technology for quite some time, and not just navigation apps. A conversation that we often have here in the research tower is how do we get past the point where people understand that, one, this is not necessarily a niche market, and two, maybe it is worthwhile to reach out to smaller markets in order to bring in more folks into, whether we're talking about travel or access to other types of technologies like 3D printing or physical computing, other things like that. Is there a conversation to be had to remove that voice in people's heads that's like, oh, I cannot get venture capital towards doing X, Y, or Z?
Well, as somebody who had my own business, Sendero Group, for 18 years, it was always at the forefront, and even the other businesses I did before that. Where are you going to get the money? You're constantly in a fundraising mode. And in a small market, what do? Well, the logical solution is to try to expand the market. So at least expand it to other disabilities and try to expand it to the general market. And that's why companies like Good Maps are really focusing on the mainstream market, and that's how they've gotten investment, and that's how some of these other companies will. If you can find a way that the application or the product appeals to the general market, then it changes the business equation immensely. Now, that's not really possible with things like Braille. That's very specific, and that's why it's so expensive. But it is possible with things like what Good Maps is doing. And their business model is that the venue owner will pay for the mapping, and then it's free to everybody who uses it. I think something like the Ray-Ban Meta glasses have gotten so much attention among the blind because they're $299, and that's because it's a mainstream product. You have another product like the EchoVision glasses from Agiga that was at CSUN. They're focusing on the blindness market. They're going to try to come in at $500, and I hope they make it because it's good to have alternatives, and it's also nice to have an open platform to run things on, because Meta is obviously not going to be as agile in terms of accessibility, although they're doing a decent job of it. They're not going to be as agile as somebody like Giga that with their specific glasses for the blind. So that tends to be the dichotomy.
For those of you who are not familiar with the Higa?
A giga, like
Giga.
a gigabyte.
Oh, well, can you talk a little bit about the attributes of that product and why it would price at $500?
Well, they're a startup, and with the Ray-Ban Meta glasses getting so much attention over the last year, a number of other companies have cropped up. And this happens to be one of them, and they got a lot of attention at CSUN. And the appeal of the Ray-Ban glasses and anybody else that appeals is that they look nice, they look mainstream, and they have a camera, so they obviously can do lots of things like record home videos and take pictures. And the Giga is doing that same thing. But they're also going to be able to run Be My Eyes, Aira, good maps, other specialized applications on them. So that's the difference between the two products. But because they're doing that, those are not applications that sighted people would necessarily want to pay $200 more for. They'll just get the Ray-Bans and use the AI that they have built in.
Thank you. I saw a question in the back.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was really interesting to hear your personal perspective in using the technology, but also how you build up the data using the Blind Army, for example, to understand where the features inside the buildings are. And I'm wondering, I'm just sitting here not knowing too much about this, thinking that whoever built this particular building has as-built to where the bathrooms are and where the stairs are. Is there no where the elevators are? Is there no way to get the architectural and engineering information from the built environment and at least get a first scrape of where the features that blind and low vision people are going to need into the database? Right.
Well, accessibility in buildings is focused on certain things that are built into the building code. And of course, changing building code takes years. So it's a slow process. But in terms of blind and visually impaired, the number one thing that helps you in the physical environment is consistency. As long as you know that you go into a building and the men's restrooms are always on the right and the women's are on the left, okay, you're a leg up. And if they're always next to the elevators, that's helpful. In airports, they're tending to put the pet relief rooms next to the bathrooms, okay? That's another piece of consistency. But there's nowhere in the code that says be consistent other than the sinks need to be a certain height, the Braille labels have to be 48 to 54 inches above the ground to the left of the knob. There's things like that, but those are really minuscule compared to the other things in the environment that could make navigating so much easier if the building codes in a building like this, or let's say a hotel, if they were more consistent. Another example is in Marriott, they have a Bonvoy-wide policy that the shampoos in the bathrooms will always go shampoo, conditioner, body wash, left to right. And that's an amazing accommodation. Most people don't know it. I'd say 90% of the hotels actually implement it. Some of, the housekeeping just gets them wrong. But Hilton doesn't have a policy. And God forbid if they establish one, if it's the opposite. These aren't the things that make it into building codes, but they are things that should have a high priority in terms of making the world more accessible. It's not always about super high-tech solutions. Sometimes it's about some pretty cool low-tech solutions.
Fantastic. Oh, I see a question over there.
And by the way, I'm a regular at Marriott because of that. One of the little things when you travel, it's so complicated. And when you get into your hotel, you don't want to have to, okay, I got to call up Ira, and I got to find out about the thermostat, and I got to find out about the shampoos. It's just nice if you don't have to do it.
All right, ready for the next question. Matthew Widener, King County Metro. I noticed during your talk that you kind of mentioned two different types of technologies that have changed over time. You started by going out and collecting, categorical data about the built environment, and then you also mentioned how there are these computer vision, systems like Meta glasses coming online, and Ira is another one that you mentioned. And I was wondering about your thoughts about, how, we as transit agencies approach this problem. In the past, we've, used like bespoke solutions like Good Maps, or other accommodations within our stations to help those low vision users navigate the system. Though I'm wondering if your thoughts, are we at an inflection point where instead of focusing on like cataloging categorical data about our stations and the built environment, whether we should shift from that approach to a different approach of just focusing on systems that help low vision users interpret the physical environment around them?
Well, as you can imagine, it's a combination. That's why I brought it up, because you can't go categorically one way or the other. You need that consistency in the physical environment. You need to convey the information, like I talked about. I mean, there's the blind army, but that's a grain of sand in the world. You need crowdsourcing to expand much further. And in the interest of making it appealing to a larger market, you want to have sharing of information, user-generated content that appeals to sighted people and blind people. So I think there's a lot to be said for melding those aspects as you try to have a more, I don't want to use the word inclusive, that's not cool these days, a more inclusive environment, and one that's easier to get through. Because I realize as I travel a lot, it's the complexity. I recognize how complicated it is to get from one place to another, and somebody who doesn't do that may not even want to go out the door because it is so intimidating, and their only solution is to go if they have sighted assistance. And one would hope that it would be a little bit easier. So it's not just about accomplishing it, it's about making it easier. And I recognize this every day in the apps that I use, by the way, that there's a lot of stuff being spewed at you. You're at a four-way intersection. Jones Street is left and right, 9th Street is ahead and behind. Starbucks is in your brain, somebody's brain is starting to go, wait a second now. That's too much information. So I'm trying to focus these days, as I'm advising some different companies, on let's step back for a second and forget about the user interface you've been developing for 2 years and say, how do I convey this information to the user? I mean, it'd be nice if you could read their mind, but short of that, how do I convey it in a consumable way that it makes it easier for them to do and not be stressed out about it?
This is Anat again. This actually brings a thought to mind. So Kunal, as you know, has developed our non-visual user interface, and we're very much enmeshed in this human factors understanding work. It's not just about saying, oh, do you want it more verbose or less verbose? What do you think is the right way to allow people to have the agency to elect how verbose they want their information? Because we find that people want different, not just different levels of verbosity, but just also different aspects told to them via the application.
It's tricky because people are different, so we're going to want different things at different times. My wife's blind, and we consistently need different ways of navigating. She's more inclined to go with a human being, and I'm more inclined to figure it out on my own. And we're just different. She's good at getting around, but that's to be expected. People are different. And then situations vary. So sometimes I'm very destination oriented, particularly if there's a time factor involved. So in that situation, I want my app just tell me when to turn and confirm once I do turn that I'm going in the right direction. This is something sighted people don't really have to worry about, because once they turn, they see the signs and they say, oh, okay, I did the right thing. But for a blind person, one of my favorite aspects of the Sendero GPS apps we had is a human voice. It's a WAV file. It comes on and it says, continue straight. And there's just this, a feeling of satisfaction. I did it, kind of like a kid, but also, all right, I can relax now until the next turn. And so I think that's a big part of it, that it is situational. Other times, I want to know, what am I passing? What's in the block? And when I created my first apps at Sendero, the first app we had was called Look Around. And it was, back in the day, there weren't routing algorithms. There was only point of interest databases. So what you could find out about is what's nearby and what direction is it in. So the world kind of revolved around landmarks and points of interest. And so that's to say, in designing the user interface, you at least need to have something that allows you to pivot between those 2 points. A look around, point of interest, tell me what's nearby, and tell me where the turn is. And so, for example, I built into our app a feature that says, if you're in a route, then 100 yards before the turn, no point of interest information will be announced. So that it's quiet, I can focus on the turning information. If no route is loaded and I'm just walking along, well then the thing will keep blithering at me nonstop if I want. And of course there's settings, but it's not always about giving people options. You want to create defaults that are what most of the people want most of the time. It's tricky, and it continues. Here I am 30 years into designing apps, and I spent the day before yesterday in Washington, D.C. with Waymap in the Washington, D.C. Metro, and this is the first time I've ever used it, and listening to the interface and going, shoot, what does that mean? I'm learning a new app, and these things ideally need to be intuitive so the person isn't having to figure it out. And it's possible to do that. It's not an impossible task. I think we can continue to make things better. But it is a combination of being careful that you're not locked into something you did start designing 2 years ago, and then things change, and today it's maybe not as ideal as it could be.
That's promising. We had Google, a Google engineer here from Google Transit yesterday, and maybe you won't agree with me, but I might summarize what he mentioned with respect to accessibility as, well, we try to do best by the largest population. And so was there ever hope in your mind that eventually they'll start building for the last 20%, or is it always going to be the case that we're designing for the majority?
Well, I mean, Google has built in a few accessibility buttons that helps a bit around intersections, but the verbosity that a blind person needs is far more than what you can get with those few mainstream tweaks. And I have gone to Google and Apple and anybody else who listen over the years and say, this stuff is expensive if I do it. If you build it in, then it would put me out of business, but it would have universal, I don't like that word. It would have a much broader appeal worldwide and be affordable into free apps if you would just do what I'm doing. So let me go to work for you and build it into your apps. And they generally say, and I started that actually with Garmin when I founded Sendero in 2000. I went to Garmin and gave them the same pitch. And at that time it was on hardware. And Gary Burrell of Garmin said, if we add $2 to our cost of goods, it's going to make us non-competitive, so we can't do it. And I think that's really what we're up against with the mainstream. Unless for some reason the accessibility that we're trying to build in appeals to the general market, they're not going to do it. So businesses like mine and many others don't have to worry about going out of business. They need us.
One more question.
Hi, Aiden Farr, King County Metro. We heard yesterday from some of the speakers, the Google engineers and others, about the benefits of an environment in which the private sector is free to innovate without government stepping in to regulate a standard, was the context that they were discussing it in. But you've also brought up things like building codes that set a sort of a minimum floor for standards, and I was wondering if you could speak to your views on when is it appropriate for the private sector to be left to sort of develop free-flowing and flexible standards, and when is it more appropriate that a government or a standards agency steps in and says, you know, that there is a public need that is not being met, and so there needs to be some minimum floor established to meet people's needs?
Well, in some ways we have no choice. But on the other hand, creating the standards, I mean, I talked about consistency and how important that is, and how do you implement that? A number of years ago, there was a standard created called ABN, Audible Based Navigation, or something like that. And it was adopted and created under the umbrella of the Consumer Technology Association. And they're big on standards. They do standards for appliances and all sorts of different devices. And so they created this ABN, and I was on the committee, and lots of other accessibility companies were. But it got created, and then it's not policed. Nobody had to follow it. So that's really where that fell down, and it might be the problem of having it done in the private sector. There's no teeth in it, whereas in a building code there is. So ultimately, you'd love to see a world where the building code says you have to have indoor maps of buildings for everybody's emergency egress, for blind people, for people in wheelchairs to know where the elevators are versus the steps. All those kinds of things should be built in, and I hope someday it happens at that policy level, because from the private sector to try to make that happen, I suppose our only leverage is make life more convenient, and so the general public is going to appeal for this kind of thing to happen.
Awesome. Oh, Doreen, do you have a question?
So my name's Doreen Cornwell, and one of my hats is advocacy committee for the Washington Council of the Blind. So I'm going to come at two things. One is demographics and kind of life experience, because somebody who's been blind from childhood has a really different perspective and capacity to process lots of different information and tools than somebody who's like 60 and aging into blindness and reading books on their Kindle is as far into tech as they want to go. More and more people are getting tech savvy, but first of all, not everybody even has devices that can run apps. And if you're, 75 and you've been using a screen reader your whole life, but you don't have anybody to like coax you and learn how to use the iPhone, that doesn't quite work. Or if suddenly you travel with is needing to use a wheelchair, and so it's not only that some of the wheelchair users I travel with go, I need you for sense of direction, but we both need a route that, if I'm with them, I need a route that doesn't do stairs, even though when I'm by myself, I can do stairs. So let's see. So there's a whole bunch of questions. There's, well, how do we handle demographics? Then there's like learning over time. Like I've come to this building many, many times. I can give you encyclopedic directions about lots of bus stops, but I still get lost. I make blind person mistakes, and I have more vision than average, but if you're totally blind, there's one set of cues and mistakes you make. If you're sighted, or partially sighted, there's different cues and mistakes you make. And so when we talk about all these apps, where do we fit the learning over time piece into it? And, there's all these people here from public agencies going, we just want to do the right thing. And I guess I'm going to come back to, I'm asking like too many questions. So the other point I'm going to come back to is standards. Like, I think it can be beneficial for people to agree on standards regardless of what the government says. And one of my examples of that is Android, where iOS, the Mac, it's way more closed, but it's not completely closed because it couldn't interchange with other kinds of standards. And Android, they've kind of come to lots of agreements, and there's still plenty of variability, kind of like when you buy a car and what's going on your dashboard might be really different. So I guess that's a question about how do you get the right voices in the conversation. If like a transit planner's like, how many people and how many vehicles can I move in this space? And I'm like, does the wheelchair lift work for the people I'm traveling with? How do you see those conversations? Or like yesterday we talked, there's an app they work on here called Access Map that gives a ton of information. And at the same time, there's still crowdsourcing about detail, and I'm cheap. I want a cookie when I put in information. So I guess I'm kind of like throwing the world at you and asking you if there's pieces of what I've said where you think there's something from your experience or the technologies you've worked with that everybody should hear. And I would also say probably not everybody in the room eats the same vocabulary for breakfast. So if yesterday there were lots of acronyms thrown around, and today the one that might not be familiar is CSUN. So I guess I want to just encourage other people to ask questions if you hear terms you don't understand. And now I would like to be the microphone before I talk.
No, okay. Yeah, let me see how I can synthesize that. CSUN is the biggest adaptive technology conference in the U.S., held each March right now in Anaheim, California. So one thing you mentioned ties back to the point that I made, that everybody's different. Now, whether it's sighted or blind, my wife and me, we navigate differently, different histories in terms of blindness. So this is just the nature of things. And as a business owner, what you try to do, because you're trying to survive and you're trying to sell product, and so you have to try to be smart about these things, and you realize I need to be appealing to the most number of people. And that's not just active travelers. If I built a product just for me, then it wouldn't appeal to a lot of other people. So that's part of it. There is an economic, a business incentive to get it right, to get to know your customer, and to understand what different blind people are needing in different situations. There's a saying that I've glommed onto over the years called the power of getting unlost. And the reason that's important is because blind people are taught typically to get around sequentially. So you have an orientational mobility instructor, and they teach you how to get around, and you learn routes. And when you get a guide dog, you learn routes, and you have to memorize them. And so they might say, go 3 blocks, turn left, go 2 blocks, turn right, go 4 blocks. And so you're thinking, was that 3-2-4 or 3-4-2? You don't know. So you got to memorize it. You got to work on it and get a handle on it and learn that sequence. But if you can get unlost because of any number of tools, whether it's because you've looked at a tactile map or because you have a GPS, you can wander around and you don't have to follow any particular route. If you want to just go for a walk on a beautiful day, you can do it. You can hear about the points that are near you. And then when it's time to go back to your hotel or your home, you put that in as a destination and you get guided back. That is the power of getting unlost. And it's completely the opposite of what blind people have been trained to do over the years. And it gives you options, it gives you flexibility. It enriches your life because now you can wander like a sighted person. And I think if sighted people said, what happens if they took down all printed signs? I mean, they're in trouble if you take down one printed sign. And this is the way blind people operate in the world. And all of a sudden, with all this information at your fingertips or in your ears, the world is available and you wake up to it. Of course, the other problem you addressed is, well, how does one deal with all that information? And some people said, that's just too overwhelming. I can't figure it out. The app's complicated. And so it gets back to my user interface question. People are used to their comfort zone. And from the time I launched GPS in 2000, at that time people said, it's too expensive. I already have ways of getting around. Blind people have gotten around fine for many years. I mean, think about James Holman, the blind guy in 1820. Got around the world fine. So why do I want to bother with this expense and this time and learning curve? And that's a good question. And I think we have to keep trying to make it easier so that people don't have that, they can't fall into that objection.
There's a question from Brendan Works. Is there a framework to document the frustration experienced in the last few feet navigation? Or yeah, it is. I guess the gist of the question is that. So, thank you.
I'm sure there's been research done on this, but amazingly, I don't know what studies have been now that could actually document the frustration of getting around or getting to that last few feet. It would be important. There was a study that Dr. Paul Pancilla did at Western Michigan University, and at the time it was the only one. This is 8-9 years into GPS being available, and he said, well, we assume that using GPS in navigation is beneficial, but is it? And so he did some studies that are published in JVIB, Journal of Visual Impairment, that documented, well, hey, yes, guess what? It does make you get more accurately to your destination, and it is more efficient. So maybe there's more that I don't know about recently. I know we did a study on indoor navigation at Sendero in 2018, and so I think this is still something we need to keep exploring.
Awesome. Well, please help me by thanking Mike again.
Yeah. Thanks very much. What a treat to get to talk about my favorite subject with a sympathetic audience, so appreciate it.